Starting the video with a disclaimer. This is my 7th day of studying Kotlin. Though my channel name is The Kotlin King, that reflects my aspiration, not the current situation. In this video, I go through things that I learned recently. Today we're going to talk about for loops and lists. We're going to start the lesson right away with a for loop where it writes for x in 0 dot dot 100 open braces, and what this loop will do is for every number starting with 0 all the way to 100, it will print each number. So let me just comment this out real quick, and when we run this, you will see here it starts at 100 at a 0 and prints all the way to 100. Okay, pretty straightforward. A couple of things to notice is that I could have chosen any variable here. I decided to use x. Notice there's two dots here, and also notice the syntax. There's a parentheses, and then here's a curly braces and print line. Relatively straightforward. This is one. We're gonna show three different for loops here, and this is the first one. Now, I also have a list here, right? And I declare a list called variable list. And notice the capital O here, the list of. And there's 4 items. We could call this elements, we could call this items, but here we have a string called Michael, integer 100, boolean true, and a double 3.14. I chose this randomly just to show 4 main variable types. And when we print this list, we get the following. Okay. Now I want to introduce a concept called index. So as mentioned, this list has 4 items. Each item has an index value that shows, think of it as where it is in the index, where it is in the list, sorry. The first item has an index value of 0. The second one, 1, 2, 3. So there's 4 items and the index value goes from 0 to 3. Okay. Now this is a very important thing that you need to become comfortable with, and it will through just repetition. But just thinking that the first item on a list has an index value of 0 or an index of 0 needs to become very normal to you. Now, remember, variable list is the list that we just declared, and when we have open brackets and we put 0, this is how we could access the value or access the item of that list. This is accessing the first item in the list variable list. So if we print this, we're gonna get Michael, and we'll see that right here, right? So again, in plain English, this says go into the list called variable list and access the value at an index of 0, which is why you get Michael. And we could do this for all 4 items. Again, the index value goes from 0 to 3. I'm probably going to repeat this over and over again, how the index of the first item is 0. But this does need to become just very, very normal whenever you code or think about the different functions and how you access information in a list. So we're printing um, each item on the list, and as expected, we get the following. Now we're going to show another for loop here, and this is different than the above that just printed out numbers. Let me just comment this out so it doesn't affect us. what we're doing here is I say for item in variable list, print item. In normal English, what does this mean? And again, I am going to emphasize this again. I could have chosen any name here as long as they're the same. I thought using item was pretty intuitive, made the most sense. What this says is for each item for the items in the list, okay? For each element or item in the list, print it, print the value of it, right? So it's going to loop through 4 times because there's 4 items for each item. So the first loop is going to go to the first item and print Michael. Second one is going to print out 100, print true, and then third true, and then fourth 3.14. This loop again says for each item in this list called variable list, print the value of each item. Um, and that's why we get this result. This is the other type of for loop, okay? And when I say this is type of for loop, I meant this is the other example that we're going to show you. I think there's 3 examples that you should be very, very comfortable with. This is the second one. Now here we're going to kind of combine a couple of the things that we just went through. In the first example, we showed how you could just print a list of uh, list numbers. I shouldn't say it's a list of numbers, just a output of numbers um, based on this format, the dot dot format. So when we say for parentheses index in 0 dot dot 3, this basically means that the index is going to have a value of 0, 1, 2, 3. Again, similar to over here, when we said for x in 0.100, it printed out the numbers 0 all the way to 100. This is going to do the same thing. Same thing we did at the top. What is different about the output here is that we're going to pass in these numbers here. Again, conceptually exactly the same thing we did here. This is how you access each item in the list. If I write variable list bracket 0, I'm going to print the first item in this list. Okay, so that's essentially what we're doing here, and we're doing it 4 times because there's 4 numbers. We're going to the list and saying what is the first item, what is the second item, third item, and fourth item. And if we print this and only this, so I'll comment that out. Here, basically, because the arrow button is over here, I just access the run by right-clicking and clicking run. I could have also used a keyboard shortcut, but this essentially runs this function for these examples. And then you get the output. It prints out Michael, 100, true, and then 3.14. Pretty straightforward. Now, I'm going to introduce you to one other thing, one more type of for loop, or I should say continuation of the above. Here, we could count, this is a way you could count how many items are in a list. You do it by doing point size or point count and 2 parentheses. There's 4 items on the list. So these two what should I call it actually? These are 2 ways I could get the size of the list. So if I print this, we'll get 4. Okay. Now why do we show that? Here, I hard-coded the number 3, right? To be able to access each item in the list. Here is another way of doing that. Now conceptually, we're going to do again the same thing. We're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to access each item in the list and print it out. Now, but instead of using 3, what I did was I looked at how many items are in the list. There's 4, but I minus 1. Why do I minus 1? Because again, the first item in the list has an index value of 0. That means that the last item in the list has an index value of 3. Okay, that's why I do minus 1, because the index values for the 4 items in the list are going to go from 0 to 3. And what we'll do here is we'll pass in the 0, and then the 1, and then the 2, the 3. It's going to loop 4 times from 0 to 3 to print the values and the items on the list. And I keep saying like print the values of the items in the list, print the items in the list. I'm just accessing each item and printing it out. Um, Hope you understand what I mean. But again, here we print Michael 100 true and 3.14. This is something that you'll see a lot in many different forms. The whole getting the size of the list, or in some cases the array, and then the minus 1, and many different iterations of this. So it's this concept, I think everything that we go through, I keep the examples very simple for a reason. I think the 3 different ways we use the for loop. Here, we just print out numbers from 0 to 100 for x and get really comfortable. I think you should actually memorize it. Memorize this x in 0 dot dot 100. When this prints out numbers from 0 to 100, we did that. This is how you create a list in Kotlin. The list of, mind the capitalization of O here. And and the index, the fact that the first item in a list starts at a 0. This took me a while to just become obvious that, oh, of course the first item in a list is 0. When we first learned this, there's obviously nothing obvious about that. Um, but I think after sheer repetition, it does become very normal to think like that. Um, Here, another way to use a for loop is basically we have a list, and I say for every item in the list, I say to print it, right? So for every item in this list, you're printing it. That's what the for loop's doing. Here is different. We want to access the item in the list, but we're doing it differently by utilizing the index value of every item in the list. This again, the index value of the first item is 0. And we're saying for index in 0 dot dot 3, which is this 0, 1, 2, 3. We're going to loop around 4 times, and it's going to loop around 4 times to give me the item, every item in the list. Here I hard coded the number 3, but instead of hard coding number 3, we're instead going to use this, use the size, or by using the count. And we're going to do index in 0 dot dot variable list dot size, which is going to be 4. The size of the list is 4 items, right? Minus 1. And don't confuse this with the whole thing about the index needing to be from 0 to 3. That is when we're talking about where is the item in the list. That's the index value. It talks about the position of the item in the list. That is different than saying, what is the size of the list? What is the count of the list? There's 4 items in the list, right? So again, through just repetition, I do think you'll get comfortable with it, but I think in order to quicken that process, just really go through the 3 examples here, and just really try to, memorize it, or refer back to it, of course. Anyways, we're going to go from the size of the list, which is 4, minus 1. Because here what we're looking for is what is the index value of each item in the list. and we need to go from 0 to 3, like we did here. So there's 4, it's going to loop around 4 times and pass in the 0 here, then 1 and 2 and 3, and print out each item in the list. And I think this lesson is actually very critical. The faster you get, this becomes normal or more normal for you. I think as we talk about now in the later lessons, arrays, objects, classes, it will just make everything much more easier, uh, be, um, especially if you get these few concepts down really well. So think of these three examples. This example for the for loops. Get comfortable with what it's doing. How it's accessing information. How it's accessing the items in the list. The way you could access the item in the list by using the index value uh, um, of the item in the list. Two different ways to do it. And if you get those three examples down, the different modifications, the different ways you access information in a list or an array or just a large amount of data, if that process would become much easier for you. And this knowing that the first item of a list or an array is indexed to 0. Uh, After a certain point, this does become kind of second nature or very normal for you. So I'll wrap it up there. And then I think in the next few lessons, we'll talk about arrays and classes. Thank you for listening.